32 years. That's how long I've been flying across this planet. 32 years of dawn seen from 40,000 feet, of storms that look like cotton oceans lit from within, of cities that at night shine like jewels scattered on black velvet. I've crossed the Atlantic so many times I've lost count. I've descended among the Alps. I've climbed skimming the cloud tops over the Himalayas. But there is one place, there is one continent that has never ceased to surprise me. A place that, no matter how many times I flew over it, always had something new to show me. There was always a color I hadn't noticed before, a shape in the terrain that seemed impossible, a scale my mind stubbornly refused to accept. I'm talking about Australia. Today, as we cross Australian airspace aboard this aircraft, I want to invite you to see what my eyes have seen over decades of flying over this extraordinary continent. Not as a tourist, not as a geographer, but as someone who has spent countless hours up there, looking down and learning to read the land as if it were a book written in a very ancient language. The first time I approached Australia was in the mid-90s. I was a relatively young first officer with just over 5 years of experience, and we were flying a long-haul route from Singapore to Sydney. It was night when we crossed the northern coast of the continent, and I remember looking out the cockpit window, expecting to see, I don't exactly know what, perhaps lights, perhaps signs of life. What I saw was darkness, a dense, absolute darkness, almost disconcerting for someone used to flying over Europe or East Asia, where the glow of cities never seems to end. For a moment, I thought there was something wrong with my night vision. But no, it was simply Australia being Australia. A continent the size of an entire country, actually the size of several countries combined, with a population that would fit comfortably into a medium-sized European metropolis. There, in that sea of darkness, there was a visual silence that caused me something between discomfort and reverence. And then, after nearly 3 hours of flying over the continent's interior, something happened. On the horizon, straight ahead, a patch of light began to grow. Slowly, like an ember someone is blowing on to ignite. And it grew and spread and gained definition until suddenly I could see the bay. I could identify the bridges, the suburbs, the unmistakable curve of the coast. Sydney, there it was. No briefing, no photograph, no colleague's account had prepared me for that moment. Sydney seen from the air, at night, arriving from the continent's interior after hours of absolute darkness, is a breathtaking experience. It's like finding an oasis in the desert, and I'm not using that metaphor lightly, because in a certain sense, that's exactly what Sydney is. Over time, I learned to recognize the city from afar by its unique coastal geometry. Port Jackson Bay, what the world calls Sydney Harbor, is one of the most beautiful natural harbors I've ever flown over. Seen from above, it looks like a hand with open fingers dipped into the ocean. There are inlets, arms of water, peninsulas embracing each other, and in the middle of it all, the bridge. The Harbor Bridge. When you see it from 40,000 feet, it looks like a seam, a stitch joining the two halves of the city. And the Opera House right there beside it, like a white sail about to set off. Pilots have a special relationship with Sydney. The approach to Kingsford Smith Airport, depending on wind direction and the runway in use, can be a spectacle in itself. Sometimes you make the turn over the bay, and for a few seconds the entire city appears in the side window like a painting. I've made that approach perhaps 200 times in my life. It never got old. But Sydney is not the only face of urban Australia worth contemplating from the sky. Melbourne, for example, is a surprise. Seeing it from above, you notice a different order, an almost mathematical regularity in the layout of the historic center, contrasting with the suburbs that sprawl in all directions like ink stains on wet paper. Melbourne lies to the south, near the Bass Strait, and when the weather is closed in, which isn't rare there, as Melbourne is famous for changing its meteorological mood 4 times a day, the city disappears under layers of low cloud, and you only find it again when you're almost on the runway. There's something curiously welcoming about that. as if the city preferred to be discovered rather than displayed. Brisbane, to the north, has the Serpentine River cutting through the urban center in lazy curves, and the city seems to grow around it with the naturalness of a plant following the light. Perth, in the far west, is the most isolated of the major Australian cities, isolated not just geographically, but in a way you can feel from up there. It's surrounded by desert on one side and the Indian Ocean on the other, and there's something about its position on the map that makes it seem, in a way, brave. A city that decided to exist where, logically, it shouldn't exist so easily. Adelaide is serene, planned, organized, with its green parks forming a ring around the center, as if the city had decided to embrace itself. Flying over Adelaide on a clear summer day, with the Adelaide Hills in the background and the Spencer Gulf on the horizon, is one of the minor but genuine pleasures of this profession. But I need to be honest with you. Australian cities, as beautiful as they are from the air, are not the heart of this land. The heart of this land is in the interior. What Australians call the outback. I've tried to describe the outback to people who have never seen it, and I always realize that words fail. Not because the vocabulary is insufficient, but because the scale is genuinely incomprehensible to the human mind. We, as a species, evolved in environments where the horizon was always just a few kilometers away, where there were trees, rivers, hills. The outback doesn't work like that. The outback is a demonstration of infinity that nature solves in its own way. Flying at cruising altitude, you look down and see red. A red that isn't traffic light red, isn't sunset red. It's an earthy, ancient, almost organic red. The iron oxide that impregnates the Australian soil gives it this characteristic color, and when the sun is low at dawn or dusk, this red intensifies to a point where it seems impossible, seems edited, seems like someone has oversaturated the colors. And over this red lines, roads that never end, roads that cut through the interior in absurd diagonals, going from one point to another without deviation, without curve, crossing hundreds of kilometers of apparent nothingness with a determination that only Australians can understand. The famous Stuart Highway, which cuts the continent from south to north, passing through Alice Springs, looks from up here like a pencil line drawn by an impatient child. A straight line that simply goes forward because there's no reason to do otherwise. Sometimes you see the tracks. The railways that cross the Australian interior are works of almost poetic human stubbornness. The Ghan, the railway connecting Adelaide to Darwin via Alice Springs, runs parallel to the Stuart Highway for stretches. And when you see it down there, two thin rails on the red earth, you think of the workers who laid them there, of the engineers who planned this route, of the generations of Australians who depended on these lines to connect the interior to the coast. But what is this interior after all? Where does all this vastness come from? To understand Australia, you need to understand that you are looking at the oldest continent on Earth. Not the oldest in terms of planetary formation all. Continents are billions of years old, but the oldest in terms of geological stability. While other landmasses were folded, stretched, invaded by oceans, and spat back out, Australia remained relatively quiet. The mountains that existed here 300 million years ago were worn down, flattened, slowly dissolved by wind and rain until they became what you see now, an immense plain, ancient as time itself, where the relief is so gentle that sometimes you have to look twice to be sure you're not flying over the ocean. This geological stability has a fascinating consequence. The Australian soil is poor. Very poor. Billions of years of erosion washed away the nutrients. The rocks don't renew themselves as frequently as in volcanically active regions. And yet, and this is something that impresses me every time, life found ways. Eucalypts that know how to survive on almost nothing. Grasses that sleep for years and explode into green with the first rains. Animals that develop survival strategies that are, without exaggeration, miracles of evolutionary engineering. Did you know that Australia has 80% of its plant and animal species exclusively native to it? 80%. That means the kangaroo, the platypus, the koala, the wombat, the Tasmanian devil. All these beings exist here and nowhere else on the planet. When geographic isolation meets enough geological time, life invents things that no science fiction writer would have the audacity to imagine. The platypus, for example, is a mammal that lays eggs, has a duck's bill, a beaver's tail, and in males, venomous spurs on its heels. If someone presented the platypus as an original creation in a literary contest, it would be rejected for lack of verisimilitude. And then there is Uluru, or Ayers Rock, as it was called by European colonizers. Although the original name from the Anangu people is the only one that truly matters, is perhaps the most photographed geological feature in Australia. But a photograph does not prepare you for seeing it from the air. Imagine a rock. A red sandstone rock, 348 meters high and nearly 10 kilometers in circumference. Now imagine that this rock rises alone in the middle of the plain, without warning, without obvious geological justification to the passerby. From the plain, it suddenly appears like a clenched fist emerging from the ground, like something the earth couldn't completely swallow, like a heart that refuses to disappear. What we see above ground is just the tip. Most of Uluru is buried, descending kilometers downwards in a formation geologists call a rockberg. The rock is 650 million years old. To put that in perspective, when Uluru was forming, complex multicellular life was still learning to exist. Dinosaurs were still another 400 million years away from appearing. For the Anangu people, Uluru is not a tourist attraction. It is a sacred place whose stories, whose meanings, whose mysteries date back to a time they called Jukorpa, the dream time. An entire cosmology is inscribed in this rock. Every crevice, every cave, every stain on the surface tells a story that has been passed down orally for countless generations. When you fly over Uluru with this knowledge, the feeling is different. It's not just geology, it's literature. It's collective memory carved in stone. And speaking of collective memory, I need to talk about the peoples who have inhabited this land for so long that the concept of ancient history seems inadequate to describe it. Aboriginal Australians have the oldest continuous culture in the world. Not one of the oldest. The oldest. Genetic and archaeological studies suggest that the ancestors of Aboriginal peoples arrived in Australia at least 65,000 years ago. Some more recent studies suggest 75,000 years. For a point of comparison, the Egyptian pyramids are 5,000 years old. Ancient Greece, with all its philosophical and artistic glory, is perhaps 3,000 years old. Aboriginal Australian culture is 15 times older than the pyramids. 15 times. When you look down and see the Australian land, you are seeing a territory that has been inhabited, known, named, and loved by human beings for a period of time that completely defies our historical intuition. Every river has a name that existed before any European language set foot on this continent. Every mountain, every valley, every rock formation is part of a network of geographical knowledge passed down through generations, with a precision that GPS has only recently been able to confirm. Aboriginal peoples developed a system of navigation and geographical memory called songlines. The idea is that the entire territory of the continent is mapped in songs. Each mythical ancestor from the Dreamtime created features of the landscape by walking and singing, and these songlines function as living maps. A person who knows the right song can cross hundreds of kilometers of unknown territory by following the verses, because each verse corresponds to an actual feature of the landscape. Think about that. Navigation by melody. Cartography by poetry. When I look down and see the outback, I can't help but try to imagine the roots of these songs crossing the territory like invisible lines, connecting sacred points, telling stories that are over 60,000 years old. Flying over Australia is also flying over a history of arrivals, of encounters. Some glorious, many tragic. The first Europeans to sight the Australian coast were Dutch navigators in the 17th century. Abel Tasman, in 1642, mapped parts of the southern and western coast of the continent without even landing. William Dampier, an English pirate and explorer, arrived on the west coast in 1688 with a scientific curiosity remarkable for someone of his time. But it was Captain James Cook who, in 1770, changed the course of history by anchoring in Botany Bay, today practically a suburb of Sydney, and declaring the territory a British possession. Cook was a navigator of extraordinary skill. Flying over the eastern Australian coast, I sometimes try to imagine what he saw from the deck of the Endeavour. Without today's instruments, without satellites, without reliable nautical charts, he was mapping an unknown world in real time, guided by astronomical observations and an instinct that transcended technique. There is something connecting 18th century maritime navigation to 21st century aviation. The same fundamental trust in fixed points in the sky to know where you are. But the arrival of Europeans brought devastating consequences for the peoples who already inhabited the land. British colonization, which officially began in 1788 with the arrival of the First Fleet in Sydney Cove, unleashed a process of violence, displacement, and cultural genocide that extended for over a century. Diseases to which Aboriginal people had no immunity decimated entire communities. Ancestral lands were confiscated. Children were separated from their families in policies we now recognize as crimes against humanity. From up above, the land doesn't tell this story directly. It simply exists, silent and red, as it always has. But knowing this story changes how you see it. Every coastal city you fly over has, buried in its foundations, a layer that official history for a long time tried to hide. Modern Australia has made efforts, uneven, insufficient in many aspects, but genuine in others, to confront this past and acknowledge the debt the nation carries. Now I want to take you north, to the Northern Territory, to tropical Queensland, to where Australia shows a completely different face from that red earth of the interior. Northern Australia is green. Dark green, dense, humid. The city of Darwin, at the northern tip of the continent, is in a region Australians call the Top End. From above, Darwin looks like a city constantly negotiating with nature. Every year, the monsoon season arrives and transforms the surrounding landscape into something that looks more like Southeast Asia than the stereotypical image of dry red Australia. The plains around the city flood. Rivers overflow. Nature temporarily reclaims what it yielded to asphalt and concrete. And then the gaze turns east, to Queensland, to where the continent dips its feet into the Pacific and something happens beneath the waters that has no parallel anywhere on the planet. The Great Barrier Reef, I'll be honest, from a commercial airliner at cruising altitude, you don't see the Great Barrier Reef the way it appears in photographs. What you see is a change in the water's color. A band where the deep Pacific, an almost violent cobalt blue, meets the shallower waters over the continental shelf, and those waters become clearer, more turquoise, greener. It's subtle from so high, but undeniable. It's as if the ocean were signing its masterpiece with a different palette. When you are at a lower altitude, on an approach, or a regional flight, the view changes completely. You start to see the shapes. Individual reefs appear as darker patches under the turquoise water, irregular, organic, alive. And alive is the right word. The Great Barrier Reef is the largest living system on the planet. Over 2,300 kilometers in length, visible from space. But the Great Barrier Reef is in danger. In recent decades, mass bleaching events caused by the warming of ocean waters have killed significant portions of the reef. From above, when you see the zones of bleached coral, it looks as if the color has drained from the world, as if someone had erased part of the drawing. It's one of the saddest images this profession has allowed me to witness. And it's impossible for me to separate this vision from the question I can't stop asking. What are we doing to the planet that shelters us? Australia has other natural wonders that deserve at least a moment's attention as we fly over. The 12 Apostles. Along the Great Ocean Road in Victoria, limestone pillars rising from the ocean like sentinels in the ruins of a drowned temple. From the air, with the spray of the wild southern ocean breaking around them, they look like punctuation. As if the continent were ending a very long sentence with a series of exclamation points. Kakadu, in the Northern Territory, a national park that is simultaneously a biodiversity treasure trove and an archaeological archive of Aboriginal rock art tens of thousands of years old. Seen from the air, the region is a mosaic of savanna, wetland systems, sandstone plateaus, and alluvial plains that completely change appearance between the dry and wet seasons. I've flown over Kakadu in December, at the peak of the wet season, when the plains are flooded and you can see water birds in numbers that seem improbable, ducks, herons, jabiroos, and the land seems to have transformed into a mirror reflecting the sky. The Daintree Rainforest in far North Queensland, the oldest tropical rainforest in the world, over 180 million years old. Where the forest meets the reef, where the oldest land meets the most colorful sea, there is an overlap of time scales that literally makes you dizzy if you stop to think about it. And Lake Hillier, in Western Australia, bubblegum pink lakes that look invented. The color comes from microorganisms inhabiting the hypersaline waters, and from the air, they seem absolutely impossible. A pilot with 30 years of experience doesn't get used to certain things. These lakes are one of them. I need to talk about scale, because no conversation about Australia is complete without an honest attempt to convey what the size of this continent means. Australia covers approximately 7,600,000 square kilometers. It is the sixth largest country in the world by area. For comparison, it's almost the size of the contiguous United States. It's 32 times larger than the United Kingdom. It's larger than all of Western Europe. And it has 26 million inhabitants. 26 million people in 7.6 million square kilometers. That means a population density of about 3 people per square kilometer. But even this statistic is misleading, because the vast majority of Australians live in a narrow coastal strip in the southeast and southwest of the continent. In the interior, in the vast, red, silent interior, the density is something like 0.0 something per square kilometer. There are parts of the outback where you can fly for hours without seeing a single artificial light. No road, no building, nothing but land and sky. There is something in this vastness that acts as an antidote to the anxiety of modernity. When you spend enough time flying over the Australian interior, the worries that seem urgent down below start to lose perspective. Civilization, all our cities, our systems, our urgencies, suddenly appears as what it always was, a very thin layer over a much older and much larger reality. Flying over Australia also taught me something about water. Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth, the flattest continent, and except for Antarctica, the one that receives the least rainfall per unit area. And yet, water defines Australia in ways only understood from above. The lake air system, now called Katy-Thanda Lake Air by its original Aboriginal name, lies in the south of the Northern Territory and South Australia, and is the lowest point on the continent. Most of the time, it's a salt desert. A lunar landscape, white and cracked, that looks like the floor of a drained ocean. But when the northern rains are sufficient, which happens in irregular cycles of years or decades, the rivers draining into this internal basin begin to flow, and water travels hundreds of kilometers along dry channels to fill the lake. When lake air fills, it's one of the most dramatic spectacles Australia offers. Millions of birds arrive from all over the continent to breed. Fish that were sleeping as eggs in the dry mud at the bottom come back to life. Plants sprout from what seemed barren rock. And from the air, what was white becomes blue. And what seemed dead reveals itself as an ecological system of a resilience you can only respect. There are moments in this profession you can't plan, that arrive without warning and stay with you forever. One of them happened at dawn, flying from Sydney to Singapore. We had already passed the Australian coast and were over the Coral Sea when, looking out the left window, I saw Australia receding behind us. The sun was rising, and the first light of day hit the east coast at a glancing angle that revealed the texture of the terrain in a way that direct light never would. The escarpments of the Great Dividing Range, the mountain range running parallel to the east coast, cast long shadows inland, and the green of the coast gave way to the yellow and red of the interior, in a gradation that seemed impossible to have been produced by accident. For perhaps 30 seconds, I looked back and saw all of Australia as a summary of itself. The green coast, the transition, the red of the interior disappearing into the horizon. And I thought, this is a place that existed for 65,000 years before any European saw it. That will exist for millions of years after any trace of our civilization has disappeared. That has its own rhythm, its own logic, its own beauty that doesn't need our validation to be real. There's a very specific humility that comes from spending enough time up there. You learn that the world is much larger and much older than our daily experience allows us to perceive. And that this grandeur is not threatening. It is, in fact, deeply reassuring. Over 32 years, I've accumulated what logbooks coldly and technically call flight hours. They are numbers. They are records. But what these numbers don't capture are the moments. The sunset seen from 42,000 feet. When the sky has 6 layers of color simultaneously and the horizon looks curved because it actually is curved. The auroras borealis and australes that sometimes rise from the darkness like curtains of living light. The storms seen from above with their internal lightning illuminating the clouds like lanterns. And Australia, specifically, has stayed with me in a way few places have. Perhaps because it is, in a way, the opposite of everything our civilization has built. Everything we value: density, connectivity, speed, noise. Australia offers the contrary: space, silence, geological slowness, temporal depth. When I was starting out in this career, younger and more anxious, Australia frightened me a little. All that darkness over the interior, all that absence of familiar references down below. Today, decades later, that same darkness is what I value most. It's a reminder that not everything needs to be illuminated, controlled, mapped to the last centimeter. That there is wisdom in the vast and the empty. As our altitude begins to decrease and we prepare for descent, I leave you with one last image. Sydney is growing on the horizon ahead. The sun is setting in the west, and the city is beginning to turn on its lights, one by one, like stars that decided to come down to earth for a night. The mirror of the bay reflects the orange and pink sky. The harbor bridge appears as a silhouette, and the opera house beside it with its white sails. Behind us, invisible now, the interior continues. It continues red and silent and immense. The song lines continue to exist, invisible to most of us, but real as they always were. Uluru continues to rise from the ground, with its 650 million years, indifferent and majestic. The reef continues to exist, fighting, surviving. Australia continues. This land that was inhabited and loved for 65,000 years before any of us even existed will continue to exist for much longer after we are gone. There's something very reassuring in that idea for me, that the world is larger than any one of us, that beauty existed before us and will persist after. That's the lesson Australia taught me, flying over it for 3 decades. A lesson you only learn up there when you have the entire land spread out below you and the silence of altitude around you, and for a few precious moments you understand exactly what your place is in the grand scheme of things. Welcome to Australia. Fasten your seatbelts for landing. And if this is your first time here, prepare yourselves. This land doesn't easily leave your memory.